So now we're in the fourth Sunday of Lent. Didn't Ash Wednesday just happen? Seems like now it was a month ago. But today is the fourth Sunday of Lent. And so as we continue on through Lent, we've been looking at different portions of the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And it's in here that we can find some of the greatest teachings of Jesus. If we want to know what it means to orient our lives around Christ, we want to look at Matthew 5 through 7 because it's not the only place where we see Jesus teaching, but it is one where we see probably most of it, at least in the Gospel of Matthew. And so it's a great place to look for Jesus and how he would like us to live. So today's teachings are all about judging, or I should say not judging. This is perhaps one of the most popular well-known teachings of Jesus, especially those who may be outside of the church. Sometimes it can be used as sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card, where people will say, if you want to say anything to somebody, they'll say, well, you can't judge me. Jesus says not to judge. And so sometimes it's misunderstood, but we have to remember the same Jesus who told us not to judge is the same Jesus who turned over the money tables and chased people out of the temple with a whip. The same Jesus who told us not to judge is the same Jesus who told the Pharisees they were children of the devil and had the most condemning words for them, which doesn't make sense. And so we say, what gives? Jesus says in Matthew 7, we're in Matthew 7 today, not to judge, and then in those places it seems like he's very judgy. What's the deal? Well, when we look in Matthew 7, first of all, let's get started with what he says first. He says, do not judge, for the standard of judgment that you use against others will be used against you. So it's kind of an equal response. The same judgment or the same standard that you use to judge others will be used against you. And there are different ways that people look at that text, different ways of understanding it. So one way that we can understand this text is we think of God judging us. And so we'll say, okay, well, what Jesus is saying then is that the standard of judgment that we use against other people is the standard of judgment that God will use against us when we die. And we go before the judgment seat, so to speak. And that's one way of looking at it. That's one possibility. There are some issues with that, as there are usually with any kind of reading of the Bible. One of them is that does that mean there's then a loophole whereby we can bypass God's judgment altogether? If we just don't judge at all, if we actually follow this commandment and we don't judge anyone at all, do we then get out of being judged by God at all? Well, the only loophole I know of outside of God's judgment, to get through God's judgment, is Jesus Christ. Not necessarily anything we can do. And so therefore, if the answer to avoiding God's judgment is just not to judge, then it becomes almost like a works righteousness thing where we do something to earn salvation. The way we avoid God's judgment is Jesus Christ and what he's already done for us 2,000 years ago, right? So that is one possible reading, though, is to say that, oh boy, God could use the same judgment against me as I use against other people. Another way to look at it could be almost like a proverb. Now, if you are familiar with the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs are a collection of sayings about life. They're not necessarily how things should be, although some of them are, but some of them are just how life is. It's just describing how life is. And so sometimes you'll see proverbs in there that just flat out contradict one another. There's one section in there where it says, don't answer a fool according to their folly. And then right after it says, answer a fool according to their folly, right? So you have to use discernment, which proverb is useful at certain times in life. And so proverbs sometimes teach how life is, not necessarily how it should be, but it just is. And so if we read Jesus teaching as a proverb, then what he's saying is a reality about life. If you judge others, they're going to judge you back. If the same standard of judgment you use against someone else, they're probably going to use against you. So just don't do it, is what he's saying. And then he continues on. But before we continue on, we want to say, okay, well then what is judgment? What does it mean to judge? If we're not supposed to do it, what is judgment? Well, judgment One way to think about judgment is what happens when we fill in the blanks and we assume somebody's intention. So we assume somebody's intention for the behavior that we see. So to give you a real easy example, have any of you ever been in a situation where you were with somebody who was obsessively clicking their pin? Have you ever been in that situation? Or maybe you're the obsessive pin clicker. No? But if you've ever been anywhere where you see somebody or you hear somebody obsessively clicking their pin, you might not think anything of it at first, but then it keeps going, Or maybe you even told them to stop and then they're still doing it. And you start to think, they're doing this on purpose. They gotta be. They could be clicking their pin that long without knowing it. And maybe you even start to think they're doing that to annoy you. And then pretty soon you lash out and you say, do you have to keep clicking your pin like that? Please stop. And then they say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even realize I was doing it. And here you thought that they were doing it on purpose, they didn't even realize they were doing it. That's one example. Or maybe, how about another one? How about if somebody cuts you off in traffic? Somebody cuts you off in traffic, or maybe you're at a four-way stop sign and they go on ahead, even though it's obviously not their turn, right? Because obviously you stopped first before they did. Or maybe they were rolling and you stopped completely, so you say, oh, that's my turn. Or maybe you're driving by on a road and somebody's backing out on their driveway right as you're going across, and it's a close call. Now, chances are in any of these situations, if that happens, you might honk your horn depending on how close a call it is, but whether or not you honk your horn, you're going to be thinking some unholy thoughts, right? You're going to be thinking some unholy thoughts about this person, like, I can't believe that person. How could they not see me there? Or they cut me off on purpose. Somebody needs to take their driver's license away. They're going to hurt somebody one of these days. But you know what the interesting thing is? When the situation's reversed, and we're the ones who accidentally cut someone off, or we're backing out of our driveway and you just didn't see that person coming, and then especially if they honk their horn or somehow show their anger, maybe in an unholy way, then we might think to ourselves, what's wrong with them? They must have had a bad day. I mean, it was just an honest mistake. I wouldn't have cut them off if I knew they were there. We give ourselves enormous grace. Because we know our intentions, right? We know our own hearts. We know what we're thinking. We know our intentions. And so in that situation, you know that you didn't see the person you cut off, or you know you didn't see the person when you were backing out. So you know that your intentions were good. But when we don't know the intentions of the other person, we oftentimes assume the worst. We assume evil intentions. And then what can happen, now it doesn't always happen, but what can happen is that when we assume someone's evil intentions, we can then start to objectify them as being somehow less than human or less than a child of God. And when that happens, then we can justify all kinds of horrible things. People wonder how it is that something as horrible as the Holocaust could have ever happened. Both people who remember it and people who may not remember it but read about it. And you may wonder, how could that happen? How could so many people perpetuate that activity and or support it or look the other way? And it's an extreme example, obviously, but it comes from objectifying. And now, we don't always objectify people when we judge, right? We don't always go to that next step. But it's a logical next step. It's a way that we can go if we're not careful, kind of like a slippery slope. So we want to be careful about that, and Jesus says, just don't do it. Just don't do it. So that's what our minds tend to do. We want to fill in the blanks. When something happens and we don't have all the information, we want to fill in the blanks, and so we do so by assuming intentions. We all do it to some extent. To some extent, we have to do it to survive. But we all do it, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. But we all do it to some extent. And it doesn't matter if it's somebody that you only sort of know, or if it's somebody in your own family, a spouse, children, parents, whatever it is, anybody, it can be anybody. And we, especially probably if we know them more, the more that we know them, the more we assume that we're right about what their intentions are behind the behavior. But the thing that we hear oftentimes is we don't know, because we don't know inside a person's heart. And so, but when we assume that, then that's what judging is. So Jesus goes on to talk about the speck and the log in the eye. Now, this is meant to be a humorous image, because obviously, who has a log stuck in their eye? Who wants to have a splinter in the eye? Oh my goodness, that sounds terrible. But it's an image, and he's saying that if you're going to correct somebody or hold them accountable, you need to be careful, because we all tend to focus on the faults of others, and it's easier for us to identify the faults of others than it is to see our own faults. There's a sermon I heard once, and they reiterated, it was almost annoying how repetitious it was, but I remember it, but it says, what is it like to be on the other side of me? None of us know that. None of us really know that, what it's like to be on the other side of me. All we can do is get into it, but we don't really know what it is like to be on the other side of me. So it's something for us to think about every now and then. And that's basically what Jesus is talking about here. Why are you, you're looking at the speck in your neighbor's eye, you don't even know that you have a log in your own eye. Take the log out of your own eye, then you will be able to see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So there is a place for accountability, there's a place for helping others, but we do it realizing that we are all frail human beings, that we all sin, we all make mistakes. And when we do so, then it can change how we do those things. And we may not always do them perfectly still, but it changes how we do those things. When we look at the Gospel of John, we see this infamous story of the woman who was caught in adultery, so to speak. We don't know what the whole story was. Back then, women, and well, really throughout history, but in Bible days, it was not uncommon for a woman to be accused of something she didn't do. And there was, laws in place that if a husband was just jealous of his wife and suspected, whether or not he had reason, that she had been unfaithful, then he had a lot of rights, and the woman did not always have a lot of rights in those cases. So anyway, in this story, there's this woman who is supposedly caught in adultery, who is brought to the temple by the religious leaders. And they ask Jesus, what should we do with this woman? The law says to stone her. What should we do? This is a trap. It's a question that they do often, that they would do this with Jesus often. They would ask a question that there's no good answer for. There is no answer that is going to not somehow get him in trouble. Now, one thing that we learn from our Lenten Bible study, which is really interesting, is that they probably had no intention of stoning her. Right? Usually when we picture this story, we picture a group of men with stones in their hands, ready to toss. And then when Jesus says, let the one without sin cast the first stone, we imagine them dropping the stones to the ground and then leaving. Makes for good Hollywood. But what we learn in our Lenten study is that the Jewish people rarely stoned people. It did happen. We know it happened. The first martyr, Stephen, in the book of Acts, was stoned. So that people did stone others, but it was very rare, certainly not for adultery. Even though the Old Testament law says that that is the punishment, very rarely was it ever carried out. Usually people would come up with some other kind of compensation against those who had been wronged, rather than stoning. And so chances are, if Jesus had answered, well, this person should be stoned, they probably would have responded and said, that's barbaric. Okay? That's a little bit different than how we normally think of it. But, after I read that, I read the story in the Bible again, and I looked for where the stones were, and there were no mention of actual stones. And actually what happens is this is taking place in the temple. Not a great place for stone throwing, right? I mean, it's probably not a good idea to throw stones in the sanctuary here. It's probably not going to be good for the sanctuary, right? So they're in the temple, so they're not ready to stone her. But this is a trap. And so they tell Jesus, what should we do? The law says we should stone her. What should we do? Jesus knows better than to even answer the question. He doesn't really answer it, or at least he doesn't answer it in the way that they think. But he says, first of all, he brings the religious leaders to account. And he says, let the one without sin cast the first stone. So then they leave. And then he talks to this woman and says, go and sin no more. Well, that's quite a charge. Sin no more, okay. Good luck with that, right? But anyway, he says, go and sin no more. So he has both mercy and accountability there. He has a good balance of both. But he does not condemn her. And he says, go and sin no more. And so when we look at the Gospel of Matthew and we look at the Gospel of John, what we see here is that we want to be really careful about assuming the intentions of other people. Like I said, we all do it. Sometimes we do it to survive. But we want to be careful about doing it in a negative way. And so often times it is that when we assume somebody's intentions, they're always bad. It's always bad intentions. We never assume the best of, I shouldn't say never, but oftentimes we don't assume the best of people. I mean, this is the way our world works, right? We rarely work across the aisle, so to speak. Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, whether we're talking politics or theology, we rarely, usually one side thinks the other side is out to destroy the world, right? I mean, surely one side has to not care about the country. Surely one side has to not care about the world. Right? And that's the story that we tell ourselves, and partially we're fed that story by the world. And so then that just creates more of that, the judgment, I guess, assuming people's intentions. And here's the thing, in most cases, people are not intending harm. In some cases, they are. In some cases, people do have evil intentions, but not usually. Usually people are doing the best they can, and they have different ideas about the best way to do things, whether it be for the nation or whatever it is. And so what if we viewed people who disagree with us and gave them the best of intentions? What if we assumed that whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, what if you assumed the other side was not out to destroy the world on purpose? You might think they're doing it unintentionally, and that's one thing, right? But at least you're not giving them the bad intentions. You know, you might disagree with them vehemently, and you might think that maybe they need some correction, but at least you're not giving them the evil intentions of saying they want to do this, they want to destroy things. What if you thought the best of them? And usually we do this, practically speaking, in life. Even if you think that there's a certain group of people that have evil intentions and just don't care about anything, usually then you'll make an exception for somebody you know, right? Maybe if they're in your family or a friend and you know them well, you'll make an exception for them, right? Because you'll say, well, they're not like that, all right? They, at least, I know that they want what's good. We just disagree on that. But all these other people, they want to destroy everything. Well, what if most of these other people didn't want to destroy everything? They just had a different idea or a different way of going about doing things, and you can still disagree with it. But then you're not assuming intentions upon them. And what if the world did that? Whether it's Republicans, Democrats, whatever it is, you pick your group. If we try to assume the best, and that's hard to do sometimes, and we're not always going to succeed, but if we try to assume the best in our families, in our nation, in our world, in our communities, then the world would maybe look a little bit more like Jesus. And so may it be so. May we seek to assume the best of others, and may we seek to love others as Christ loved us. Amen.